Hello, this is week 5 in our Vineyard series on risen, what it means to be risen with Christ and live in the kingdom of the Spirit. So this week we're going to look at kingdom values. But before we look into kingdom values, we're going to do a quick review on what we've done before, because I thought it would be a good point to look at where we've come from and then point ahead to what we're going to do next. So we looked at inheritance, which is when you so there's a TV series called Who Do You Think You Are, in which basically people are trying to understand who they are in terms of who their ancestors are. But with the Christian faith, we understand who we are in terms of our spiritual ancestors. So we might look back at people like Abraham or David or Jesus and Paul and so on, and to see them as our spiritual family, and to understand ourselves as having their history as our inheritance. Week 2 we looked at the invisible world. Everything that we believe, we believe in, everybody believes in an invisible world. There's the way that we construct the world, the way that we understand the world, we can't simply work with physical objects. We have to have a certain set of beliefs that we project onto the world and the way in which we understand the world. So everybody's got a set of beliefs and in the way they think of the world. And faith is another set of beliefs. It's not like some people believe and some people don't believe. We all believe something, and what we believe in is basically invisible, because we believe in values, we believe in a certain understanding of the past, a certain understanding of how we anticipate the future, all sorts of things that we believe that you can't see and touch, but are important to how we understand the world. In week 3 we looked at time and eternity. In particular, the Christian God is both in and out of time. Through Christ and through the Spirit, God is connected to us and exists in time, and he suffers with us, he feels everything that we feel, and we're connected to God and God's connected to us. So there's a very important aspect of God that is time bound and experiences things in time, and participates in the temporal reality. But then God is also outside of time, and we thought about how what that might mean for God to be outside of time, whether time itself could could change, whether the past could change, whether God could constantly be refining and modifying the whole of time, the past as well as the present. So time and eternity. So that was week 3. Week 4 we looked at humans being story-centered, how unsettling it is when we watch or read a story that has an unsatisfactory ending. We always have this sort of notion of what a right story is, how a story should, has a beginning, a middle and an end. And some stories, some films, some books, we feel, oh, it had a good ending but it didn't, maybe the middle wasn't right. But within ourselves we've got a very definite set of the way we a set of expectations about what makes how a story should be. And we know when a story doesn't end right, when something's off. And so when we look at the human story, if there's really, Christianity gives us a human story that hopefully feels right, that makes sense of life, and that if we don't have that way of understanding ourselves, then what story do we tell ourselves? What story is there to say, does humanity have a good ending? How does our story work, both as individuals and collectively? What is the human story? Right, so that's where we've been, what we've been looking at the last few weeks is week 5, which is going to be about kingdom values. So, most important thing I think to start from in kingdom values is that we exist in God in a place of abundance. There's no scarcity. All around us people talk about scarcity, think in terms of scarcity, but the economy of God is governed by abundance. The promised land was described as flowing with milk and honey. In other words, an abundance the promised land is a place of abundance. So in God we have more than enough. And this means we are not in competition, and we should not think of ourselves as being in competition. Competition leads to conflict. It's not how God made us, but from every angle we are told in the world that is how we should see things, in scarcity and competition and conflict. Whereas from abundance, the kingdom value of abundance means that we think in terms of cooperation. And this leads us to being willing to make a contribution. That is how the kingdom works, and that is how it succeeds, and that is how God made us. So think of some examples. The prodigal son. The father could have complained that the son had spent all his money wastefully. If he had a scarcity, if the father had a scarcity mentality, he would have seen, to his son, you spent all money wastefully and you need to make up for it. But he didn't have a scarcity mentality. He had an abundance mindset, and therefore when his son returned, the father lavished his son, spent more money, celebrated his return with a feast. In the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan shows no fear. He doesn't think of, is it going to be me or this other person, when he sees the guy who'd been attacked. He thinks of the other person first. Remember, the Samaritan was the enemy of the Jews, and Jesus was asking for attitude of cooperation. He was saying, we are not in competition with these people. So don't think of it as either or, them or us. There's only so much to go round. If we give it to somebody else, we won't get it ourselves. That's a scarcity mentality. The Samaritan, when he takes the guy to the inn, he says, look after him, give him what he wants, and if I owe you any more, he gives the innkeeper some money, and he says, if I owe you any more, I'll pay you next time I come past. So he had an abundance mentality. Think of the workers in the vineyard. To each person according to their need. The owner wasn't looking at what he was getting from the person. He wasn't thinking, you're only working for me for an hour, I'm only going to pay you for an hour. He knew that each person had a family to feed. They needed the money for a day. They didn't need the money for an hour. He gave them what they needed, not what he didn't think of himself as, if I give you, too much money, I won't have enough myself. He had an abundance mindset. And so he happily gave each worker what they needed. He didn't try and keep some back for himself. So in our times, in our culture, we are encouraged to think that we are always in competition with others. It's a scarcity mindset to think, there's only so much cake to go round. If I give the slice to somebody else, there won't be a slice for me. And many times when our society, we actually create scarcity artificially. For example, when we're in education, in learning, giving a mark, right? Given all the pupils like A, B, C, D, it allows them to compare themselves and to say, I got an A, you got a B. It's a way of creating a competitive mindset. It's not to say that work shouldn't be marked, but it doesn't have to be given ABCs. It can just be marked, right? You can say like, you spelt this word wrong or whatever. The point of sport, remember, we have sport all around us, and sport is all about this scarcity. It's two teams, they can't both win. There's a winner and a loser, and so not that there's necessarily things wrong with that, but I'm just saying it's a way in which we constantly are encouraged to have a scarcity mindset, a competitive mindset, if all around us we're having these paradigms of scarcity and having paradigms of competition, it just encourages us to think that way all the time as well. But in fact, even with sport, just imagine, like, you know, if you're playing with some friends, if you're just having a kickabout and you're not keeping score, say with football or table tennis or something, it's actually a happier game. You know, you're just enjoying kicking a ball about or hitting a ball backwards and forwards with a table tennis ball. The moment you get into competition, you can start to generate bad feelings. And so, you know, even when you're doing sports, you don't necessarily have to always turn it into a competitive activity. And the really funny thing in today's society, think of cooking. Is cooking competitive? Well, not in itself, obviously. It's actually a very cooperative thing, and, you know, usually a very generous thing to say to people, come round, I'll cook you a meal, you know, we can eat together. But even in our society, cooking's got to be made competitive. So we've got, you know, Top Chef, or you know, these cooking programs where every week somebody gets eliminated, and Master Chef is what it is. So it takes an activity that isn't by its nature competitive and turns it into a competitive event. Decorating. Why, you know, why do we have these things where we have decorating programs in which there's some sort of element of competition added, or music or dancing? You know, there's always something, you know, like you go to a music concert, it's where's there's no competition to it, and yet we have TV shows which, you know, turns music into a competition. It creates a scarcity mindset, and again encourages us to think always in terms of competition. And, you know, it's us and them, and if you know, I don't win, if they, you know, we can't both win. It's to think in competitive paradigms and not seeing yourself as being in a place of abundance and cooperating. To constantly be in competition with others surely creates stress, anxiety, fear and worry. We become hamsters on the wheel, and we can think of examples that when we imagine ourselves to be in competition with others, and we have that as our mindset, we have this scarcity mindset that we're constantly in competition, it just makes us you know, stressful and anxious, totally different to how God wants us to be. And it's because we're not really operating on kingdom values, which are, as I've said, living in a place of abundance and seeing, always thinking of yourself as having enough and enough to share, so that you want to cooperate and share and give, and not all about get. And it's also, you know, I would just encourage you to try and reflect, be a bit mindful. How does being in competition make you feel? What sort of emotions does it bring up? You know, when you're competing against somebody else, is that really a healthy state of mind that you're in at the time, compared with if you were looking to cooperate with other people rather than compete against them? Over and over, God gives us examples of not being in competition. If only we can see that that's the message he's giving us, like the Sabbath rest. The Sabbath rest has an abundance mentality, because it says we don't need to work every available hour. It's like with the Jubilee year, you know, having a year off. We're not looking to maximize profit. It's saying we have enough. We don't need to be constantly trying to make. When Jesus says take no thought for the morrow, he's saying we already have enough. Don't stress about things. The Israelites were in a land flowing with milk and honey. They had enough, and yet they looked at the nations around them and wanted to compete with them. Once they started having a competitive scarcity mindset, that was when things start to go downhill. If they'd have just had an abundance mindset and said, look, we've got enough, God provides, then they wouldn't have wanted to get into confrontation and competition with nations around them. And, you know, once you get into competition, you get to confrontation, and it's a slippery slope to violence and terror. So in kingdom values, we need to always look for competition, we need to always look for cooperation and not competition. I was watching a program about the suffragettes the other day, and it's interesting that when they were getting ignored and becoming more and more militant and becoming more and more radical, it was kind of like they had a competitive mindset. Like they were just trying to beat the opposition. They'd created this this set of us versus them, and the more they were trying to kind of beat the establishment down and force them to do what they wanted, the more it became a competition, and you know, the establishment was trying to beat the suffragettes, and the suffragettes were trying to beat the establishment, and you know, it was not a productive period really. It was the suffragettes were like, we need to kind of force people to do what, you know, to give us the vote, which is what they're after. It was only when by a huge irony really in the war effort that the women and the men cooperated together, and they came together, and at that point, you know, that although obviously war is competing against another nation, in terms of the British nation, the men and the women started cooperating and not competing, and then of course the men could see that, you know, all of the great things that the women could do, and how valuable they were, and you know, what a huge contribution they made when they were all cooperating together, and as a result of cooperation, at the end of the war, of course, women were given the vote. Not completely what they wanted, but eventually they got parity with the men. So it was cooperation that really, you could see, delivered rather than competition in that example. So it is when we show that we can make a contribution that we gain respect and value. So if we think of women, you know, writing great novels, making contributions to mathematics, Florence Nightingale was primarily a statistician. You know, she was using mathematics and statistics to really found the principles of modern nursing. Amelia Earhart flew the Atlantic. Marie Curie was a physicist and chemist who developed the theory of radioactivity. Emily Noether was a German mathematician whose critical work advanced the fields of algebra and physics, and Albert Einstein said of her that she's a significant mathematical genius, and he actually said, not just his opinion, but in the minds of most competent living mathematicians, that she was a mathematical genius. So Big Brother is this system in which everybody's fighting with each other, and that's, you know, terror, that's a bad society. When Israel cooperated with other nations, they prospered. So my point about the women was cooperation led to respect, led to establishing equal rights and so on. So yeah, in the history of Israel, cooperation with other nations. Look at the way Joseph cooperated with Egypt, and Babylon cooperated with Daniel. There you get, you know, good things happening. We always need to think basically in terms of cooperation and not competition. It was when Christians showed they could make a contribution to the Roman Empire with their hospitals, schools and care for the poor that they became respected by the Romans. Even the pagans tried to copy the Christians because the Christians had become so successful in cooperating and contributing. The ironic thing is, when you stop competing, that is often when you do your best. Finland is often regarded as one of the best, if not the very best, education system, and studies have shown that creating a relaxed, enjoyable, and they are specifically very against having a competitive mindset. They always have a what is essentially an abundance mindset, and of cooperating and getting people to contribute. Studies of work have shown that creating a relaxed, enjoyable working environment is the best way for people to get work done. Collaboration and cooperation between researchers, scientific researchers, yields the best scientific discoveries. And ironically, the show Big Brother, in which everybody's kind of competing to try and be the winner, is everybody, as if you know the show, someone gets voted off each week or at regular intervals. Is actually very often the least competitive person, the person who actually just wants to go in there, make friends, cooperate, contribute. The public likes that, and they are very often the one that wins and not the most competitive person. So being risen with Christ means we have more than enough. We have an abundance of all that we need. And even the phrase Jesus first, others next, yourself last, is actually the wrong mindset, because that's a scarcity. That is a scarcity mindset, by saying, oh, how do I prioritize things? Prioritization kind of implies that there's some scarcity going on. When Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, there's no competition. He's not putting one before the other. He's not saying love your neighbor first or love yourself first. He's just saying both the same. So that's cooperation, that's abundance. You don't need to think in terms of scarcity. Even in that saying, he's promoting a cooperative, abundant mentality. So all kingdom values, I would suggest, flow from seeing abundance and not scarcity, cooperation, not competition, love, kindness, compassion. And it's all because we're not competing. We are sharing and giving. Thank you very much.